publication of stories on interculturalism. So I'm basically going to try to let writers speak, I guess. Let the text speak about that issue. Over the past decade or so, I have found myself being most enamored by literature produced by ex-Singaporeans. But in my teaching and even developing a course on Singapore literature, I find myself in a quandary about whether I should use such texts to represent a Singapore literary canon. The novels I love were written by American and Canadian citizens, and although the writers spent their formative years in Singapore and set their stories here, is it acceptable to deny local resident writers recognition of their national status, to give over their place to those who, in local parlance, we call the quitters? The trouble is that these ex-Singapore writers speak more to me, perhaps because of my minority context or class location, I'm not sure. They speak to me about the intercultural connections that I have grown up with, and which for me constitute Singapore culture. Less of this CMIO stuff. For example, there is Fiona Chong's novel Shadow Theatre, also by an ex-Singaporean, who is now professor a literature professor at an American university. She invents in her novel Shadow Theatre an intercultural Malay, Chinese, Chindian, Catholic, suburban middle-class Singapore world of the 1990s, which recalls to me my 1960s and 1970s Singapore world. Perhaps not coincidentally, the author had left Singapore in the 1970s and could have projected her memories into a later temporal setting of the 1990s. I was a devout Catholic in my early and teen years, but my first childhood memories of a spiritual aura or of the Muslim calls to prayer that I heard emanate daily from a mosque near my grandfather's home, where I grew up. I had an uncle who had married a Malay Muslim, and a younger uncle who was then dating the Chinese woman he would later marry. Although I came from a Sri Lankan Tamil family background, we listened to Malay and English songs at home. I recall speaking to my immigrant grandmother in a mix of Malay and English. It was a world of cultural connections that I never saw reflected in local texts, which tended to be monocultural. I can only speculate that this kind of culture was driven from our cultural memory by the 1980s state discourse on our CMIO racial identity. A Western friend who settled in Singapore from the mid-1980s laughed at Cheong's novel and said it was exoticizing Singapore, and was shocked to hear that it had so much resonance for me. I can't help thinking that perhaps a more complete memory of local culture can only be accessed from outside the nation, from the diaspora that has escaped the state's attempt to rearrange our culture. Yesterday, Max Lane spoke about how exciting it would be if Singapore would allow itself to be a hub for the region, serving as a pathway for multiple cultural flows. I'd like to talk about a novel that I think has imagined that kind of excitement and written it into an identity. In this novel, this place called Absence, Lydia Kwa, an ex-Singaporean, now a Canadian who makes regular visits back to Singapore, writes about an ex-Singaporean gay psychologist narrator now settled in Canada. This narrator seeks to rewrite her identity in a manner where she can locate herself at the intersections of her former national and current national identities, i.e. Singaporean and Canadian, as well as identities as in terms of her maternal Buddhist and paternal Methodist, Cantonese and Peranakan ethnic parental cultural heritages, and including her North American training and her chosen profession as a psychologist. She also strives to connect all these to a gay sexuality history. The novel starts with the narrator having a nervous breakdown upon hearing of her father's suicide in Singapore. Her father had made a transcontinental call to her, but she had missed it and so falls apart on realizing that as a psychologist she had not been able to help her own father. In psychoanalytical theory, a nervous breakdown is about the stalling of the process of making meaning. Wu Lan, the narrator, could not make meaning for her father nor for herself, hence the need to for her to recover by creating new, empowering meanings for herself. The novel has multiple narrators. Besides Wu Lan, we have the voices in direct speech of her mother, as well as two female immigrants who came to Singapore from China from the late 19th century and who get forced into the sex trade, eventually falling in love with each other. One was to commit suicide, while the other, who later married and migrated to Jakarta before returning to Singapore, is Wu Lan's ancestor. These narratives, which could be diary entries or thoughts of the characters, are not, however, separate, discrete narrative voices, but possibly imagined by Wu Lan herself. Her mother's thoughts relate to transcontinental conversations that Wu Lan has with her mother, or to letters sent to her, or they spring from memories of her mother, which are also mentioned in Wu Lan's part of the narrative. Thus, the mother's subjectivity appears to be Wu Lan's creation. As for the Aku's voices, these could have been imagined or reconstructed by Wu Lan after having come across a real history book of sex workers in Singapore by the historian James Warren, which she finds in the Vancouver Central Library. The book contains photos of Akus and constructs history from recorded voices and court and coroner's reports. She also brings in information she has gleaned from her family about her female ancestor into creating one of the two Aku's voices. The intercultural identity that Wu Lan constructs is replete with translations. First, in creating the Aku's voices and narratives, Wu Lan had to research history texts that included translations from Chinese oral accounts into English, done by a Western writer. Wu Lan then had to retranslate that English idiom into believable early 20th century Chinese dialect immigrant voices imagined in English. The Akus sing songs that are adapted from Chinese songs that Kwa acknowledges to be from English translations. Then we have the narrator's mother's voice, which is Singlish married with a Malay dialect used by Peranakan women. The narrator also combats her father's Christian intolerance of Buddhism to probe her maternal religious heritage, visiting a Buddhist temple in Vancouver to seek a translation of a given name, given to her by her maternal grandmother. Here, in a Canadian translation or transportation of the Chinese heritage, Wu Lan finds out that her name comes from the word Wu Shi. I'm probably mispronouncing that. A boundary word meaning both exorcist and healer, i.e. what is conceivably the Chinese equivalent for the Western psychoanalyst, who heals through the talking cure, casting out previous neurotic narratives. Thus, Wu Lan has become the person her grandmother had dreamed she would be. The Anglo-Canadianness of Wu Lan's training and culture is conveyed in the text through epigraphs of American and feminist poetry and other European texts that, in a global context, are also familiar to the Western educated in Singapore. Even the central spiritual absence that haunts Wu Lan and her father is grasped through various translations and intertexts. It's a similar emptiness that one of the two Chinese Akus gives into, as it is the experience of Marlon Brando's character in The Last Tango in Paris, which is significantly a transnational movie. The spiritual emptiness is also linked to the bereavement expressed in Edith Piaf's French song La Vie en Rose, which was a hit in the Anglo-Saxon world. The emptiness is also likened to the futile attempt to feed the hungry ghost with food and alcohol during the Hungry Ghost Festival. The novel is not so much a quest for identity as one that is about constructing a new intercultural identity. As Anthony Appadure says about the era of globalization, the imagination has become a social practice, a form of work, relevant for new forms of desire and subjectivities. But as construction, it is not untrue, since Wulan's imagined intercultural identity is based on Lydia Kua's actual bilingual knowledge of English and Chinese languages, on her being a psychologist, and on her drawing on translator expertise and on recorded history and family narratives. All part of her actual moving through Canadian and Singapore spaces. It inserts a Singapore story into the narrative of Chinese immigration to Canada. Kua's novel gave me an opportunity to think of Singaporeanness in a more complex way than in thinking of it within the state's hegemonic CMIO multiracialism discourse of cultures that coexist but which are separate and which are to be kept separate. It allowed me to imagine Singapore identity within a globalized context as an intercultural place that is traversed by intersecting histories, translated cultures, and multiple routes of travel, both past and ongoing. It calls up a Singaporean identity that is undecidedly Singaporean and Canadian, hence simultaneously national and post-national. It exposes the reductivist nature of the seemingly commonsensical urgings by the state that we preserve our roots. All this did was to make us racially more aware. It also destroyed some ethnic dialect cultures and erased, I think, more complex memories of the past. Today, I think we've become more aware, as Clifford James tells us, that the origins of our culture lie in roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, not roots as in R-O-O-T-S, in traveling, in cultures being transported and translated, even mistranslated through different locations. But as the distinction between home and the world, the national and the transnational collapses, resident Singapore writers too have moved from exploring Singapore's multiculturalism towards imagining interculturalisms and the contact zones between our different ethnic cultures. Right? Alvin has done a bit of that, but I want to discuss one story. In Alvin Saad's short story, Foreign Language, published in his Malay Sketches collection, interculturalism is imagined as a cross-cultural romance. A Malay woman who works as a government archivist is enrolled in an Arabic language course where she wants to extend her secular vocabulary in Arabic and meets a French-Canadian man who is learning Arabic to deepen his understanding of Islam. Mysura has since her teenage years only ever been attracted to men outside her ethnic culture. On the one hand, this expresses her interest in approaching her otherness. But it is also her way of avoiding being rejected in love. She uses the proscription against cross-cultural romance, guilt about what she says betraying her brothers, her own community, to prevent her from actually getting involved in any relationship at all. It is only when Jacques raises her awareness to this and also suggests to her that no culture is entirely foreign to another that he enables her to set aside her fear of betraying her own culture. As he points out, the Malay concept of jodoh, of a fated love, can be translated into the French concept of le destin nous a remis. The story ends up beautifully with Jacques suggesting to her that she should always be my Sarah, which she interprets doubly as an injunction to always be herself, and also to be my Sarah, as in M-Y, my Sarah, i.e. Jacques Sarah. I think Alfian imagines interculturalism as being like love, in that love guarantees, or should guarantee, that it won't be a case of the colonizing of one culture by another, or an assimilation of one culture into another, but that there will be a negotiation of difference and sameness, which I suppose is the ideal of all good translation. The phonetic sounds of Jodo and the Destiny in the text, their different sounds but similar meanings, captures this similarity-difference friction. But this is not just a Malay-French relationship. It's also mediated by two other languages and cultures, Arabic and English. I think if we do want to conceive of our identities in a way that captures the realities of daily living in a globalized world, virtual and otherwise, and also of honoring the roots of our past, we have to move away from thinking in terms of fixed cultures and even multiculturalism, which is merely for me the coexistence of multiple fixed cultures. We have to acknowledge that we exist in language and cultural contact zones, both past and present, that we are translated beings. Isn't the immigrant in a way the original translated being? But I think in the past we have always been made to feel guilty about that, as if it meant being less of a person, being authentic or impure, guilt that is based on false notions of culture. We have to get over that, like my Sarah.
Thank you. Very often we hear that we are a multicultural society, and very often we also hear that we are a migrant society. And so thank you very much for bringing forward the idea of roots and travel. And if we do look back into the roots of our past, we would notice that those borders that we have crossed are also point of contact and not just territorial borders that protect us from each other. And talking about roots, it just led me to introduce our next speaker, Sasi, who deals with the reality every day of people who have traveled from many different, from many parts of the world to study, to work at the ITI, the Intercultural Theatre Institute, where he is artistic director. Without much ado,
Thank you. You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. Caliban, tempest. What we fail to understand sometimes in thinking and talking about translation is that fundamentally it is about language. And language is fundamentally about identity. And identity is always about our sense of freedom, our sense of who we are. Therefore, if we do not consider the space within which translations can happen, if we do not enable a space within which mutually conflicting words can come into contact, then translation is not possible. Therefore, ultimately, all consequences of translations are acts of imagination. They are ultimately creative acts. And there is a radical translation involved even within a singular language. When speakers of apparently the same language are speaking to each other, translation is happening. We are translating thoughts, we are translating inflections, we are translating bodies, we are translating sounds. It is a reality in which we are immersed. It is not something extraneous. It is translation that enables communication to happen. It is translation that enables meaning to happen. Fundamentally, I think, and I have no scholarship to back this up, it comes from working with people who come from different worlds. There are three elements that are irreproachable, incontestable when it comes to translation. There is identity, there is recognition, and there is difference. And unless we come to terms with all of these three elements, which interestingly enough have emerged in all of the presentations that we've heard today, unless we are able to contend with these three elements, communication is not going to be possible, and meaning is going to be impossible. There is also some other fundamentals which I think we have to recognize. One is that cultures are radically incommensurable. No two cultures are commensurable. They are radically different, and we have to recognize the otherness. We have to deal with this otherness. And in Singapore, we've, long before the PAP, Singaporeans have been dealing with the other. The only way that you can deal with the other is through imagination and through trust. Which in turn I would propose is essential for any kind of translation to be viable. Therefore, my contention is the creation of the intercultural, the construction of the intercultural, which in turn enables the construction of a different world within which differences can cohere, is an act of imagination. It is a fictive world. It is a creative act. And like all creative acts, it is only possible if we are free. If we are empowered. If we can be spontaneous when we need to be. When we can move out of structures. When we can rewrite the rules. In other words, it's an act of liberation. This is why interculturalism is embedded in the individual as opposed to multiculturalism, which is imposed by usually the state. This is why interculturalism is voluntary, whereas multiculturalism is to some extent always coerced. And my own contention is that interculturalism is the result of a desire for promiscuity. We want to break out of boundaries. We need to breach lines, to cross a border, to transgress, as it were, so that a connection can be made, so that meaning sometimes can emerge. The other thing which is constant is that cultures, despite being radically incommensurable, are always mutually enriched by contact. I think if we hold these propositions firmly in our minds, we will see that no intercultural project could possibly be managed by the state. No intercultural project could possibly be encouraged by the state because it is fundamentally subversive. Interculturalism is radically subversive. And it's impossible without translation. It's impossible without contextualization. It's impossible without the assumption of the subject to at least countenance the notion that identity is a fiction and that it can be erased and it can be rewritten and overwritten. Question is, who is doing the writing? Who has authorship to this fiction that they are going to create? This is a political question. The state inevitably wants to retain the power of authorship. But in retaining the power of authorship, all that the state can do is impose multiculturalism. It can never ever transgress into the space of the personal. Because when I learn the language, I may choose to curse you with it. So how then do we think about the intercultural? How can we conceive the intercultural? Well, we can talk about it in terms of interactions. We can talk about it in terms of penetrations. But the most useful way for us to think about it, the way I'd like to think about it within ITI, is that the intercultural is a gift. Is a gift that we mutually make to the other. And there is nothing at all that you can say about a gift of the giver. This is fundamental. When somebody makes a gift to you, maybe it's a new vase, maybe it's a box of chocolates, no amount of examination of the gift, whether it's a vase or a chocolate, will ever tell you who the giver is. And this too is part of the intercultural. Because in accepting the gift, you have to accept the fact that you will never completely know the giver. That you will never completely understand the giver. You can only hold on to the gift. And the only way that you're going to be able to respect the giver is to respect the gift. Therefore, the intercultural happens when we make mutual offerings. When there is an exchange of giving, which ultimately cannot be policed by the state. And it's ultimately an act of humanity and imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi, for that very powerful presentation, and I think that very timely reminder that translation, just like the act of giving, is perhaps an act of trust, and that very often we need to, and we have to just have that faith or have that trust that translation or giving is a risk worth giving, which is in a way what the title this morning of So You Want to Be a Translator, So You Want to Be an Interpreter is about. Well, without holding on any more time, I'd just like to open the floor and invite any questions. Any questions?